Okay, everybody, welcome to this discussion. Where does consciousness come from? We talked about some of the mysteries of consciousness in the last video, and this one will somewhat overlap in some instances anyway. Some of the things we discussed, just to reinforce a few points, but we're going to dive much more deeply into this matter. Both consciousness and life are two great mysteries to modern science and not so easily defined, right? We already talked about how consciousness has different levels, if you will, different modes. What we call consciousness as humans isn't the same as what we call consciousness in plants or bacteria. But clearly, they have a form of consciousness, even though they don't have brains, right? They exhibit characteristics that we define as consciousness in humans. They perceive their environment, they have the five physical senses, they perceive them in different ways, but and they process them in different ways, but they still respond to them. So clearly, there's an awareness in plants and in microbes of their environment. So yes, it's a lower form of consciousness, but consciousness nonetheless. Everything alive has consciousness. Everything with consciousness is alive, right? So there's obviously a relationship between living things and consciousness, a relationship that is inseparable. So is consciousness and life itself synonymous, or is one a subset of the other? Either way, they go hand in hand. Wherever one goes, the other one follows along with it. They're inseparable. So, what are they? Where do they emanate from? Um, is life, endemic? Here's another important question to ask. Is life endemic to organic entities alone? Or does it somehow emanate from non-living material? That sounds crazy, right? Sounds like a new age type of question to ask. But the truth is, there's a lot of energy in the subatomic world, right? That only in the past 100 years or so have we finally figured out that we never knew was there before. They discovered radioactivity by accident about 100 and maybe 30 or so years ago. A scientist left uh, a roll of film in a drawer with a piece of uranium, a sample of uranium. And later, when he went to use the film, he discovered it was no good. It was already exposed, as though uh, the cartridge was opened up in a brightly lit room. And so it was a mystery. How did this thing become exposed? So he experimented and put another roll of film in the drawer. He finally traced it to this piece of uranium. So, he started testing the uranium. Anyway, long story short, it was discovered that this piece of uranium was emitting a non visible light. That's how radiation was discovered. X rays were coming from the uranium and exposing the film right through the cartridge without having to open it up and expose it to regular visible light. And that X-ray radiation comes from the same source that light rays come from, right? The subatomic world. Atoms are loaded with energy. So, in order for us to tap into those subatomic forces of energy, we need equipment, right? To light our room up, we need a light bulb, which helps to tap into the subatomic world. When we turn the light on, it's actually extracting energy from the atoms in the filament of the light bulb and helping to light our rooms. That energy is there. It's just not accessible without a piece of equipment to tap into that energy, right? Could it be that our bodies and our brains are tapping into a form of subatomic energy? That life did not come into existence at birth and that it doesn't end at death. Life is always there. You just don't perceive it in a rock per se because something is needed to tap into it. Just like a light bulb on its own doesn't light up, it doesn't seem to serve any function until you screw it in the socket and hit the switch. Now it becomes useful. Now it's able to tap into that subatomic energy and produce light. You see what I'm saying? That energy that makes the light is always there, but it needs an instrument to tap into it to bring it out and make it useful. Are our bodies the same? Are our bodies an instrument to tap into what we call life, which is yet another energy source, subatomic energy source, that can only become, recognizable to us because our bodies are tapping into it. At death, the body is no longer tapping into that life source, but that doesn't mean the life source is gone. It just means the body has exhausted its usefulness, just like a light bulb that burns out, right? That light bulb has exhausted its usefulness, the physical light bulb. But the energy source doesn't go away. It's still there. Uh, you know, it sounds like an interesting analogy, but that's just baloney. Why is it baloney? There's actually a lot of secular scientists that are coming around to this view. Uh, and so that's what we're going to be exploring. And we're going to be looking at a lot of, not just what I mentioned, not just by analogy, we're going to be looking at actual scientific evidence to corroborate these points. Now, I'm not even suggesting that I totally believe this, right? I'm open to it. I'm just presenting it because I found it fascinating and I think it's worth other people checking out. If nothing else, keep it in the back of your mind, which is pretty much what I'm doing. I'm not saying I totally believe it, but I see it as something, feasible. There's a potential there. And, unfortunately, mainstream science, as always, poo-poos this and says, no, absolutely not. They poo-poo a lot of things that have turned out to be true, haven't they? And they still do. And at the same time, they advance a lot of ideas that, upon close inspection, turn out to be absolute crap. So, mainstream science isn't necessarily a good guide to lead you to a proper understanding of science, right? Sometimes it's a great inhibitor thereof. So we need to learn to think outside the box. Anyway, so yeah, is life/consciousness a subatomic force that our bodies are tapping into? Our body doesn't create life, it's just tapping into it. Our brains don't create consciousness. Our brains are just an instrument to tap into that force that's already there. And so when we talk about organisms that don't have brains, they still have life, and so they're still able to tap into, quote, consciousness. Even though they don't have brains, they can't utilize that conscious force the way that we do, right? Because they're a higher tech instrument, if you, they're a lower tech instrument than what we are, right? But still, they're tapping into that same force, according to this theory. It seems to make a lot of sense. So they don't need a brain to process in a complicated way the way that we do, because their bodily functions, if you will, are simpler. But they're still tapping into that force and still exhibiting traits of what we call consciousness. This makes sense in this theory, which is called panpsychism, by the way. But I would extend it to call it pan-lifism, if you will, too, because, again, I synonymicize life and consciousness really as one and the same thing. It's just different manifestations of the same force, if you will, a potential subatomic force that we can add to the list of the weak and strong atomic forces, electromagnetism, and, quote, gravity. Of course, I think gravity is just another form of electromagnetism. But in any case, stick with me, again, even if you think this is crazy, stick with me, because as we go along, you're going to see that there's quite a bit of evidence leaning in this direction, such that even if you don't accept it, and I haven't fully accepted it yet, but I'm open to it. I hope you'll at least be open to the idea that, yeah, this might, it seems to explain a lot of things. It might be the answer that we've been looking for to explain and account for life and consciousness. Everybody knows that the brain gives off waves, right? Alpha waves, beta waves. It's a transmitter, if you will. So if it can transmit waves, signals, why could it not also receive signals? Maybe the brain is designed, if nothing else, to receive signals from the subatomic world, just like a radio is designed to receive signals that are being broadcast and then turn those signals into a recognizable pattern of words. And in the case of a TV set, although nobody receives radio waves from TV sets anymore, but it's all cable now. But you know what I'm saying, right? TVs, like radios, used to pick up signals, and they would transfer those signals into visible pictures and audible sounds that you can recognize. Is that what our brains are doing? But the fact that the brains also give off waves is interesting, isn't it? Maybe there is something to ESP, if you will, right? Maybe it's something that in ancient times we were more readily able to tap into, but now, our bodies have degraded. We've lost a lot of our abilities. And I'll get into that discussion sometime of how we have genes that have turned off. They're no longer useful. We used to make vitamin C. Did you know that? We have the same genes that a lot of animals have that don't need to eat vitamin C. Their bodies naturally produce it. We are one of the few creatures left that have to make vitamins. That have to eat vitamin C, right? We don't make it anymore. But clearly we once did. So our systems have degraded. Our bodies have degraded over the centuries, the millennia. They don't do things anymore that they used to. So is it possible that our brains were once able to receive the beta waves and the alpha waves that they transmit and make use of them? Maybe they still are making use of those signals in a subconscious way that we're not aware of. But were we once able to consciously process that information and make something of it? Computers actually are able to do that. I don't know if I want to get into that discussion right now. I'll talk about it in a future video in more detail. But they've actually been able to pick up brain waves with computers and turn, they'll tell a subject to think of a short 3 or 4 letter simple word, and all of a sudden, boom, the word that the person is thinking of pops up on the screen. The computer's picking up the brain waves. The person keeps repeating the word cat, for example, and bang, the next thing you know, the word cat appears on the screen. They can do this, which is pretty amazing, but at the same time, it's pretty scary, right? Computers, reading your mind. This is what's behind, Elon Musk's Neuralink, which is very, very scary. Sure, it could have some good applications, people who have brain damage and whatnot, but that's not really why they're doing it, right? They're all into mind control. This is ultimately where they want this to go. But in any case, the brain does emit information in those brain waves. And, it appears that at least at one time, we may have in fact been able to receive that and make use of it remotely. So the brain apparently can transmit and receive signals. Is one of those signals the signal of consciousness and or life itself, right? Are our brains processing centers, or radios, if you will, that receive this information from the subatomic world and now turns it into something useful, just like a radio receiving a signal? This is what panpsychism is all about. This is what a lot of scientists have concluded, or at least they believe that the potential is there for this to be the explanation for how consciousness works, how life works. And again, I find it quite intriguing. So many people for the longest time, and there's still some, who have been very skeptical about the idea of plants having consciousness. But there have been a myriad of books documenting a myriad of experiments demonstrating that plants do have a form of consciousness. One book in particular is called The Revolutionary Genius of Plants by Stefano Mancuso, or Mancuso. Very interesting read. Here's a quote from that book. "All plants are capable of learning from experience and therefore have memorization mechanisms." Yes, plants do exhibit a memory. Many laboratory experiments have confirmed this. Once they learn a new behavior, They will remember it days, weeks, months, and in some cases even years later. They will respond the exact same way, whereas initially when the experiment was done, they didn't respond at all until the experiment was run several times and they finally learned, okay, this is how I need to respond when this happens again. Once the behavior is learned, they will never forget it. They remember it, so that when the experiment is run again years later, in some cases, the plant will respond accordingly, just like it did initially years earlier. Plants have memories. This has been confirmed. And again, if you doubt it, get this book or any number of other ones along this line. They will show you the experiments that have been done to prove this point. A lot of skeptical scientists who formerly balked at this now are coming around and saying, yeah, I've actually duplicated these experiments myself and seen that this is what's happening. They can't explain how it can happen, right? Because according to conventional wisdom, you must have a brain with neurons to process this information and store memories. But no, plants are doing this as well. How are they doing it? According to panpsychism, they don't need a brain for memory. A brain can help and can help you to express your thoughts, with verbalization. Plants can't do that, but they clearly do have a memory. So, something other than a brain is enabling them to do this. Are plants, because they are alive, tapping into the life force and thus the consciousness force? Are they able to tap into something that's outside themselves that doesn't need a brain to accomplish? They're accomplishing it on a much lower level than we do because we have a sophisticated brain, right? But they're still doing it. So again, panpsychism, scoff at it as many will, is offering a much more feasible explanation. In fact, an explanation at all. Whereas the scoffers don't have an explanation for things like this. Let me give you one example from this book just to wet your whistle regarding plant memory, right? When the tendrils of a pea plant are severed, they can be stimulated to curl as though they're getting ready to wrap around a twig, to grow on them, to wrap around them, simply by rubbing the base. But it's been found that this only works when the lights are on. Rubbing their base in the dark won't produce any response. However, if they are rubbed in the dark and then exposed to the light a couple of hours later, the tendrils will in fact curl. So the plant remembers that it was exposed to the light several hours earlier, such that now when the base of the tendrils are rubbed, they will in fact curl. It remembers the light or being exposed to the light several hours earlier. This experiment has been repeated again and again. These plants always respond the same way. So there is what can only be described as a memory. This is only one example. Like I said, there's many more. You can get this book or any number of other books like it that document this stuff. The only people who deny that plants have memory now are those that haven't done these experiments to see for themselves. It's kind of like scientists who deny that animals have emotions, that they can express compassion and gratefulness and even love, right? The ones who say that are the ones who either never deal with animals or the only time they deal with them is treating them like lab rats, where the animal isn't going to express love because they're living in fear of their keepers, right? But anybody who has actually had a pet and loved a pet and treated a pet endearingly knows that the pet returns that endearment, returns that emotion. Pets do have, they're highly sentient beings. They do have love. They express it. They express gratefulness. They understand the reward system. They not only love being rewarded for good behavior, they reward you as well in different ways, of course. But, a cat will go catch a mouse thinking that it's something you want, They're rewarding you for taking care of them. They're showing appreciation, blah, blah, blah. So, the same scientists who deny that animals are sentient and compassionate creatures are the ones who will deny that plants have memory. because they never worked with the plants. They've never taken the time to run experiments where they're not hurting the plant, just testing its abilities. The scientists who have done these things, yes, they have discovered they do have memory. So there's a lot more going on the surface, right? And under the surface, a lot more than what meets the eye, and a lot more than what a great many scientists will allow for. If you allow yourself to be hemmed in by what these skeptics are saying, who have never actually done these experiments, of course you're going to think it's BS. But the minute you start looking at what other scientists, the heretic scientists, have done and discovered, and maybe even conduct some experiments of your own, then you'll start seeing that, yeah, there's something to this. There's something beyond the confines that have been set for me, that have been hemming my thoughts in. I need to expand my horizons beyond those confines to realize that there may very well be an explanation that might make me feel uncomfortable because I've been told it's baloney, but this explanation does seem to at least provide something to make sense of all of this, whereas mainstream science hasn't offered anything. And again, just to give you another example from the microbial world, bacteria, for example, release chemical signaling molecules called autoinducers, to measure the population density of the colony that they're a part of. Once a threshold is reached, entire colonies change their gene expression collectively and act in a collective fashion. They don't act as individuals anymore. They now are aware that they're part of a colony, and they all change how they act as individuals to be in harmony with the rest of the colony, to advance the lifespan and the productivity or whatever, of that colony, so everyone mutually can benefit. They will attack a host collectively. They will form, biofilms collectively, or build fruiting bodies, to expand their horizons, to grow. They will all act in accordance. Did you know heart cells do the same thing? You can take two different heart cells and isolate them, that are still beating. You can separate them from the heart, and they'll still beat for a time. And they'll be beating out of sync with each other. But the minute you move them in close proximity, within a few millimeters or something, they will instantly start beating in unison, because these two heart cells that supposedly don't have any intelligence recognize that they're in close proximity with another heart cell. They can sense that that heart cell is beating. They're not touching, but they are in close proximity to each other. And so they assume, oh, okay, I'm not alone anymore. I am part of a collective whole, and we all need to beat at the same rate and timing, the same pulse, to be beneficial for this organ as a whole and the body that we're a part of, right? If the heart dies, we die as individual cells. So they will instantly beat in sync with each other, even though they're not even touching. So, I mean, it's a far more complicated process than what some would have us think, right? There's something going on there at the cellular, the molecular level, perhaps even the atomic level, that's driving all of this. Bacteria have been known to give off toxins when they sense another foreign microbe approaching their colony. They collectively will all produce this toxin to drive away and or kill this approaching microbe that they deem as a threat to their colony. So there's communication going on. There's memory, right? They might have experienced this same invasive predator or whatever before and knew what type of toxin worked with it, so they'll produce that same toxin because they knew it worked effectively in the past. So microbes have memory. They're able to communicate. They're able to function individually and differently when they're part of a colony, right? They function collectively. So this implies some degree of memory, of consciousness, awareness, information processing, while yet not having a brain? Are they simply tapping into something outside themselves, or maybe from inside themselves on a atomic level, right? Is there a thing called a life force that emanates from the atoms that comprise their beings that they're tapping into, much like our brains, right? Do our brains produce consciousness, or are they simply tapping into consciousness? Remember, it can't be nailed down as to what actually defines consciousness, right? And how it emanates from. Because even though you can cut off certain parts of the brain, or people who have had parts of their brain removed, consciousness has been noted to relocate, in some cases anyway, right, to other parts of the brain, or at least what handles consciousness can be relocated to other parts of the brain. Some people are born with, almost all fluid in their heads, right? There's only an outer periphery of brain matter, and yet these people are fully functioning. So the parts of the brain that ordinarily would handle certain functions have relocated now. So, it's really hard to nail down where is consciousness actually coming from. The brain, once again, seems to be more of an instrument tapping into a force called consciousness rather than creating it. I talked about how the neurons in the heart carry memories, right? People who are recipients of heart transplants can, develop new tastes that they never had before, have memories of the home that the donor lived in when they were never in that home before. On and on it goes. This next point is going to blow your mind, and we're going to get into this later in detail, so I'm not going to elaborate on it right now. But let me just drop this bomb. It has been noted in experiment after experiment that bacteria can actually engage in generational inheritance of memory and function. That is to say, a memory that is learned, or a memory that is gained, or a behavior that is learned by today's generation of bacteria can actually be passed on to the next generation genetically, if you will, who did not experience this stimuli that the previous generation did. And it's not just bacteria that can do this. We'll be talking about this later. How can that be? People, most people would say, no, that's not possible. You can only pass on actual physical genetic traits. No. Learned behaviors and memories have been noted, documented, to be passed on to later generations that did not experience those things that generated the memory, did not engage in those behaviors. They can learn from what a previous generation had learned and retain memories, or tap into memories that of things they never experienced. The previous generation experienced them, right? This is passed on genetically. How is that possible? It would seem impossible unless you believe that the life force and the consciousness force emanate from the subatomic world, and that when a living entity taps into that force, it's able to benefit from, the learning experiences of previous generations. Again, I'm not saying this proves panpsychism, but it offers an explanation for things that mainstream science has left us in the dark on, right? You have to learn to look outside the box and see what others are finding, even if you think it might sound like it's crackpotism or new age poppycock, because a lot of times they've got some impressive documentation. They've got evidence to show that, geez, that's, if nothing else, at least it makes you say, huh, right? It gives you some more material to stuff in the back of your head that you might want to tap into at a later time, that might corroborate with things you learn later, and might make you want to revisit what you had previously investigated, and cause you to change your opinion on some things. We've often heard the expression simple cell, right? A simple individual life form, a simple cell. Even the simplest of cells can do this and that and that. There's really no such thing, though, as a simple cell. It just means they're less, visually anyway, they're less complex. They don't have as many organelles or, whatever. Don't engage in as many chemical reactions, don't have as many protein sequences, blah, 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 blah. But nevertheless, even the so-called simplest of cells engage in extremely complex activities, right? Such that, again, there really is no such thing. It's a misleading phrase, simple cell. There's no such thing as a simple cell. They're all complex. Every one of our, whatever it is, 5-6 trillion cells in our bodies contain DNA, right? And each strand of that DNA contains all the information necessary to technically rebuild another one of you, right? All the information, your heart, your lungs, your brain, to reproduce another one of you. That's a lot of information storage. That's a very complex intelligence, if you will, to have all of that information stored in there. So why should we doubt that each cell has its own, quote, intelligence, right? Every one of our cells technically is a living entity all on its own, but they all work collectively for the benefit of the body as a whole. But they are their own living entities. I mentioned the 2 heart cells, They know their job is to pump. They also know their job is to pump in sequence with all the other heart cells. If they're separated, they'll pump out of sequence. The moment you move them together, bang, they instantly will jump into sequence so that they're beating in unison, because they know that their job is not only to continue beating, but to beat in unison with all the other heart cells. It's amazing, isn't it? There's a lot of intelligence in one single cell. Where is that intelligence coming from? A single heart cell, unless it's a neuron. The heart has a pocket of neurons, don't forget. But average heart cells are not neurons, right? And yet they have intelligence. They respond to their environment. They know they have a function to perform, and they perform it. Circumstances can alter that, like, when the 2 heart cells are separate and you move them together, they'll beat in unison. They will respond to their environment accordingly, knowing what their job is supposed to be. Where's that intelligence coming from? According to panpsychism, again, it's coming from outside the cell, if you will, or again, from inside, but from non-living matter. It's coming from the atoms that comprise the molecules of those cells, right? Seems to make sense. Otherwise, these things don't make sense, right? How can plants have memories? They don't have neurons. They're tapping into something that doesn't require neurons. Neurons are required to engage in more complex processing of this information, but because they're alive, they have enough structure to respond accordingly for what they need to do. But they're still tapping into what we, have to define as consciousness, an awareness of their environment, perceiving the 5 senses, right, and responding accordingly. A brain isn't needed for that. We've already demonstrated that. So what are they tapping into to process this information and respond accordingly? Apparently, this subatomic force that we have not yet been able to isolate, but we haven't been able to isolate gravity either, have we? Of course, I believe gravity is electromagnetism, but nevertheless, most scientists talk about a graviton when they've never isolated a graviton. They're just making this stuff up, right? How do we know that life itself might be something that they, at least as yet, have not been able to isolate? They haven't been able to isolate a photon. They can isolate an electron, but not a photon. They talk about them as though they're real, and they may be, but they have not been able to isolate the thing. Everyone accepts the existence of photons, even though they've never isolated one. Why should we doubt that it's not the same with the life force and the consciousness force, right? Which I'll argue is probably the same thing, right? Life and consciousness are one and the same. How do we know that that's not a subatomic particle, if you will, or some form of energy that our bodies tap into, our brains tap into, that we just have not been able to isolate yet? It's just beyond our capability at the current time. It might remain beyond our ability. Who knows? But it's probably there nevertheless, just like a photon is there that we haven't been able to tap into and isolate yet. The website evolutionnews.org, and I'm not a necessarily a big fan of evolution, although obviously living systems do evolve over time within species, right? But in any case, nevertheless, evolutionnews.org reported on November 19th of 2018, quote, memory, new research reveals cells have it too. So these are the same scientists who are largely skeptical about plants having memory, but now they're recognizing that cells, individual cells, have memory. They remember things and respond accordingly, having learned from a previous experience, having developed a new behavior. They will repeat that same behavior when the same stimulus is exposed to them again in the future. So, again, a brain isn't needed for memory, right? A brain can enhance memory and make the retention of memories, more complex. Retain memories in a more complex fashion and relate them and whatnot. Yes, a brain is needed for higher functions like that, but a brain isn't needed for memory. A brain isn't needed for the sensory functions. A brain isn't needed for responding to sensory functions. Once again, plants do this, all of this, without a brain. Microbes do this without a brain. So, consciousness and life itself seems to stem from something beyond the living organism's capacity to produce, right? It looks like living organisms, from a microbe to a giant redwood tree, are all tapping into something beyond themselves, right? Probably from the subatomic world. Life is probably just another form of energy trapped in the atom, just like electromagnetism and so forth. Don't forget that each one of us began as a zygote, right? The union of the sperm and the egg cell. And that initial zygote really contained all the information to produce what we are today. It was all there. It just took time to grow, for the cells to divide and expand and become specialized. This cell for the heart, that cell for the liver, on and on. But all the information was right there. That zygote was really everything that we are now, just in a different form. But all the information, everything was all there. And I've mentioned this on other channels I've done over the years. Some of you probably heard this already, but I'll mention it again. They only discovered this recently, back in 2014 or 15, I believe. They discovered it with humans, frogs, several other mammals. Now it appears this might be the case across the board with all animals that give live, not just that give live birth, but that have, all mammals, let's put it that way. Everything with a spinal cord so far that they've experimented with, that they've studied. At the moment of conception, when the sperm and the egg cell meet, the zygote actually glows in the dark. It actually gives off light, sometimes very briefly, other times for several minutes. It varies from one individual zygote to the other for whatever reason, but it doesn't matter. At the moment of conception, at the moment when the sperm and egg cell unite, there's this glow. They've traced it to the actual glowing comes from potassium ions in the zygote. Okay, well, fine. They know what it is that's glowing, but that doesn't tell us why it happens or what it even means, right? What does that mean? What's going on? Why does it glow? Is it because this new zygote now is tapping into the subatomic world and now getting its, consciousness and life force, its new form of life force anyway, that's going to make it unique from other zygotes and other humans or frogs or whatever that it's going to grow into. Is it announcing that it's tapped into that force now, and that force will remain with it as long as it's alive, right? When that entity dies, that force doesn't die with it. Remember, energy cannot be created or destroyed. Energy is always there. It can be tapped into and used for various purposes, but the energy pre-existed the time that the piece of equipment tapped into it, if you will, or the living entity. That life force was there before the thing came into being, and it'll be there when that entity ceases to exist, right? It breaks down and returns to the dust, if you will. But that energy that made it alive is still there. It didn't come into existence at the moment of conception. It just joined ranks with it, right? And remained with it as long as that entity was still alive. But when that entity dies, the energy is still there. So birth and death have nothing to do with this energy force. It's always there, always has been. And it emanates not from living things, it emanates from physical, non-living material, atoms, right? Apparently, according to this theory, and I find it fascinating, according to this theory, the life force exists in the confines of the atom along with all these other energy forces, right? It's only that living entities are tapping into it. It doesn't begin at life. It doesn't end at death. It was always there. Just like, radio signals don't begin when you put a radio together, and those signals don't end if you drop the radio and break it and it's now useless. The energy is still out there. You just get another radio to tap into it, right? The energy is always there. It's not created or destroyed. It's appearing, if this theory is correct, that that's what life and consciousness are, or is, if it's one and the same thing, which I think it is. Our bodies are just tapping into something that was always there and always will be there. But I'm just getting warmed up here. We're going to be diving into this pretty deep and looking at some more surprising and fascinating, compelling pieces of evidence to corroborate this even more. This is still basically the introductory stage of this discussion. This is going to be a series, multiple-part series. But like I said, I'm not even saying I necessarily subscribe to it, but I am definitely open to it. I find it fascinating, and I think it is something that we should at least consider as a possibility, something that might, in fact, explain what, to the rest of science that scoffs at stuff like this, can't explain. Like I said, many scientists have been toying with this idea, and several of them have been brave enough to actually come out and discuss it openly. For instance, Gregory Matloff, a veteran physicist at New York City College of Technology, recently published a paper arguing that humans may be like the rest of the universe in substance and in spirit, he said. A proto-consciousness field could extend through all of space, he said, and he argues that stars may be thinking entities that deliberately control their paths, that are operating as individuals, but also in cooperation with the whole. Sounds crazy, right? But look at how orderly the universe is. Most scientists will say, oh, well, that's because they're following natural laws. But is there something deeper going on? We're going to get into this later about inorganic material responding in very strange ways that almost seem to imply a living conscious force, right? Just to wet your whistle, some of you are probably aware of the double slit experiment. Now, I've heard some people say that, oh, well, we can't confirm that. We don't have a laboratory. Well, here's the thing. I'm not so quick to write it off as bunk because it's been reproduced thousands and thousands of times since it was first discovered in the early to mid 90s. And I haven't read If I'm wrong, let me know if somebody else has read something along this line and I'm just not aware of it. But I haven't read anything, I haven't seen anything that attempts to debunk it and say that it's not true. The double slit experiment, and there's other things too, that's only one. For those that aren't aware of this, let me just mention it now. And that's probably going to take us to the end of this video. Yeah, I like to keep it around an hour. This was first done in, like I said, the early to mid 90s, and then many other scientists, again and again and again, have done this same experiment, and it's come out the same every time. Like I said before, we've not been able to isolate a photon, right? A single particle of light, if you will. But we know that photons or light can act like a particle 1 minute and a wave the next, just like electrons. Electrons also exhibit that same behavior. They're very similar. An electron can act like a particle 1 minute, a wave the next. So they couldn't conduct this experiment with photons because they can't isolate a single photon, at least not yet. But they can isolate a single electron. So here's what they did. It's been known for a long time now that if you take a flashlight and shine it through a board that has 2 slits in it, the back wall, what you'll see on the back wall after you shine the light through those 2 slits, some would guess, if you ask them, what do you think you're going to see on the back wall? They'll say, oh, 2 slots of light. Yeah, common sense would dictate that, but that's not actually what happens. You actually see a myriad of interspersed bands of light, darkness, light, darkness, light, darkness. Not 2 slots of light, but multiple slits or slots of light interrupted by slots of darkness, right? The reason for that is all of those particles, all of those photons acting as waves, when they go through those 2 slots, they're interacting with each other and they create what's called an interference pattern. Just like if you drop 2 petals in a pond, the ripples are going to bang into each other and cancel each other out every other time a wave hits another wave. So this is what's happening. Those waves are interfering with each other. They're bouncing off of each other, and they're producing a multiplicity of lighted bands instead of just 2 bands, right? So they thought, okay, let's try this with a beam of electrons. They fired a beam of electrons through a double-slitted plate, and sure enough, you can't see the electrons hitting the back wall, but they put sensitive detection equipment there, and it confirmed that this beam of electrons produced the interference pattern, right? They're acting as waves, just like photons. You don't get 2 slots of electron particles hitting the back wall. You get this interference pattern of multiple bands of electrons striking with darkness, if you will, in between each of those bands. So they thought, okay, so far it's acting as predicted. Let's see what happens if we fire a single electron. They can single out 1 electron. They fired it and they predicted, well, this electron is going to go through one of the slots, and we'll just see on the back wall that 1 electron hit the back wall, right? That's what was expected. But that's not what happened. When they fired the single electron, they got an interference pattern on the back wall. They're like, wait a minute. How the hell is that possible? If they fired 2 electrons, they would expect that because the wave of each electron would interfere with the other and would create that pattern, and you would get, multiple bands on the back wall. But you don't get that, or you shouldn't get that, with just 1 electron. What is the wave interfering with? There's no second wave with a single electron. So they started developing all these crazy theories. Maybe it's moving so fast, it's going through 1 slot, coming out and going through the other slot so fast that its waves are interfering with each other when the particle isn't actually physically there. But they thought, no, that can't be. That doesn't make any sense. Maybe it splits in 2 and still produces waves, and those waves are interfering with each other. They didn't know what to make of it. So they said, okay, what we're going to do is we're going to put some sensors inside of the chamber. Right as the particle comes through, we're going to be able to detect what it's doing. We're going to see if it's going in one hole, coming out, going in the other really fast, or if it's splitting or whatever, right? We're going to try to determine what's going on by tracking the path of the electron. So they put the sensors in the back chamber, and they fired the single electron again, and guess what it does? It produces only one band going through one of the slots. They're like, wait a minute, how can this be? It was producing the interference pattern until we put these sensors to monitor its path, and now it changes its behavior and acts like a particle instead of a wave. They removed the sensors, fired the single electron, and again, now it produces the interference pattern. They put the sensors back, fired it again. Now it acts like a particle and only produces one band, right? Instead of the interference pattern. This experiment has been repeated again and again and again around the world. They've coated the sensors with lead, thinking maybe the sensors themselves are interfering somehow. No. They've ruled out every conceivable possibility of what could be causing this. So the only conclusion that they have been able to make so far is that the electron knows when it's being watched and doesn't want to know doesn't want anyone to know what it's doing. I mean, it sounds crazy, right? But this is, in fact, the best explanation that scientists can yet come up with. The same ones who poo-poo the idea that plants have memory. Well, I mean, that's starting to change. A lot of scientists are finally starting to come around and admitting that. But nevertheless, right? These are the ones who were formerly saying, no, individual cells can't have memory. They don't have brains. That's changing because of experiments like the double slit experiment. But that's only the tip of the iceberg. In the next video, in the next several videos, I'm going to be getting into some other things like this that seem to hint that inanimate matter, non-living matter, might indeed have some form of what we are calling consciousness. It seems like these electrons that they've been firing are playing mind games with the scientists, right? It acts like a particle when it's not being watched. It acts like a wave when it's not being watched. But the minute you try to observe what it's doing, the minute you watch it, it acts like a particle. It doesn't want you to know what it's doing and how it does it. It's pulling a magic trick, if you will, and it's like a magician that doesn't want you to know the secret of its magic trick. I mean, some would argue, that's ridiculous. No, you can't explain it in those terms. Well, how else can you explain it? All I'm saying is, I'm not saying this proves anything, but it seems to suggest the suspicion of panpsychism, that consciousness and or the life force emanates from what we would call non-living matter, that it is a force that emanates from the subatomic world, not just within the confines of an atom, but apparently within the confines of individual atomic particles like electrons, because these electrons are responding in a way that seems to suggest an awareness that they're being watched and don't want the observer to know what they're doing. I mean, come on. All of the books that I've read on quantum physics make that suggestion. And they'll admit it sounds crazy and that they don't even want to put this on paper. But they said this is the best explanation we can come up with, so far. So, like I said, though, this is only the tip of the iceberg. We're going to be getting into this in more detail. We're going to be looking at other aspects of research like this that also seem to be hinting in that direction of some possible intelligence coming from inanimate objects or subatomic particles, right? That does seem to support the idea of panpsychism, that what we call consciousness not only doesn't require a brain, it doesn't require anything living. It doesn't require a plant or a bacterium or some other microbe, right? That consciousness and responding to the environment in an intelligent way can be done by what we call inanimate objects. And yet, if this theory is correct, then there really is no such thing as an inanimate object, right? This would imply that all material has intelligence and or life trapped in it, but we don't perceive it because it's trapped in the subatomic world, in the particles that comprise that inanimate object. But that object might be teeming with that energy, every bit as much as we as living systems are. But we can see that life being manifested because our bodies are designed to tap into that force. A rock isn't. But yet the force might actually be there all along. This is mind-blowing, and it sounds new agey, but like I said, there's scientific-based reasons for drawing these conclusions. And I've only just, been presenting the tip of the iceberg here, like I said. The series of notes is pretty lengthy. In fact, it's 40 pages long, and I'm only on page 6 right now. So this is going to be at least 4 or 5 more videos to cover this. I hope you'll stay tuned. I think you'll find it fascinating. And even if you aren't convinced, I'm not saying I'm convinced either. But I think, like me, hopefully most of you anyway, will at least be able to say that, yeah, that's something to consider. It could be. I'll keep that in the back of my mind. If nothing else, I hope that at least this discussion will accomplish that. All right, everybody, thanks for joining me. And like I said, lots more to come. This is going to get crazier as we go along. So thanks for joining me. We'll catch you in part 2. Take care.